Hi, I'm Ash Sarkar for Stand Up and Spit. I am a barmaid, poet, and general girl about town, and today I'm talking to the Big J, aka Janine Booth, aka Lethal Jizzle.
Not heard that one before.
No. Do you have anything else you'd like me to add to that, apart from ranting, poet, and...
No, I mean, I was the Big J in the 1980s. I perform under my proper name these days, Janine Booth, but obviously I don't mind people remembering.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you feel that more accurately reflects your on-stage persona now, or do you feel...
Possibly. I mean, in the 80s, everyone had a stupid stage name, so it was... and these days, everyone who's doing poetry is... Well, most people are doing it under their own name. But also, I've done a lot of stuff in the 25 years in which I wasn't doing poetry that I've got a bit of a name for. I've written some books and I've been heavily involved in the trade union movement and stuff, so people know me by my name now.
Okay, cool. So the first thing I wanted to ask was, what about ranting poetry attracted you to the scene and the form? And if, in your own words, you could explain what ranting poetry is and what it means to you.
Okay, I think this probably all started for me with being a rebellious teenager. So I kind of felt at odds with the world. I'd gone from being a school nerd to being a total rebel and getting expelled from school and stuff like that. Felt at odds with the world. Didn't think anyone felt the same. And ranting and music were... When I came across them, I realised that other people did feel the same. And that's what attracted me to it. So the original turning point actually was in, I think, April 1980 when Going Underground by The Jam came out, which is not only a fantastic song, but it's about feeling at odds with the world. It's about not accepting the values that society places in front of you. He's got lines like, you'll see kidney machines replaced by rockets and guns, and the public gets what the public wants, but I don't get what this society wants. So I realised there was this kind of culture where there were people who felt similar to me. Until that point, I didn't really know any of that. I should mention at this point that I grew up in Peterborough, which was pretty much a cultural desert. I heard nothing to suggest to me that it's changed at all since then. So I got more and more into music, reading music papers, going to gigs when I could, bearing in mind I was only 13 at the time. But eventually, I decided to set up a fanzine.
So when did you set up the fanzine, and how long after the epiphany of Going Underground was that?
The story continues to relate to the Jam, actually, because I set up the fanzine in either very late 1982 or very early 1983. I was 16. I set it up in the gap between the Jam breaking up and the Star Council setting up, and that, I think that's probably of some significance, because when Paul Weller broke up the Jam, he was saying a lot of stuff about encouraging people to come forward, encouraging young bands. He set up a record label and a publishing company. He started publishing poets, that kind of stuff, right? So that kind of encouraged me. I was at school, and I kind of heard about fanzines, but I hadn't really come across any because of the aforementioned cultural desert that I lived in. But it seemed like a good idea, and I was always up for doing something like that. I'd run some little magazine about wildlife when I was about 9.
So the DIY impulse had been there for a long time.
So I put this fanzine together called Blaze, which you can have a look at. We did 5 issues in the end. Anyway, so when I was putting issue 1 together, I thought, who shall I interview? So the kind of standard format for a fanzine was you would write reviews of the gigs you've been to. You'd write reviews of other fanzines in the expectation that they would write nice reviews of yours, and you'd try and interview a couple of people. And I was thinking about who could I interview, and I thought, Attila the Stockbroker chap, he sounds interesting. Oh, the other thing you'd always do is a local bands page, which, if you live in a cultural desert like Peterborough, was a bit of a struggle to fill, but hey. But I thought Attila sounded like an interesting chap, and what I'd heard of his poetry sounded good, so I contacted him via his record label, And I went down to interview him. Was this for the first issue or the second issue? I can't remember. But that, again, I think is a significant point in my getting involved in ranting poetry. I could tell you exactly what date that was, because it was the date of the FA Cup final in 1983, because his team, Brighton, played in the FA Cup final against Man United and should have won. Only in the last minute or something of the game, Gordon Smith missed an open goal where it would have been easier to score.
That seems like the story of English football all over, though.
Absolutely.
But
and so they drew, and they lost 4-0 in the replay a week or so later. But the point being, so I went down to London from Peterborough, quite a journey when you're 16, it's about 100 miles that, to the Cricklewood Hotel where Attila was doing a gig. And I'd arranged to interview him before a gig. But because of the FA Cup final, he was already pissed by the time I got there. And we did the interview, and I don't know how well you know Attila, but he's pretty much just as articulate when he's pissed as when he's sober. And that went in the fanzine, still exists to this day in my heap of fanzines. And I think that was probably the first ranting poetry gig I went to. And
so your first.
So this is a very long answer to the question, what attracted to me. No, we didn't have ranting poetry in Peterborough. We had a rubbish lower division football team and not much, and a few pub bands really. Not even big bands on their national tours didn't even stop off in Peterborough. We went on coach trips to Nottingham or Leicester to see bands. It was that much of a cultural desert.
So ranting poetry was also a way of getting yourself out from a town where you felt there wasn't much going on for you?
Possibly, or well, we first started doing ranting poetry in Peterborough, which kind of,
so you were
lit the town up a bit. So, having seen Attila at that gig, I think, and I was never going to be Paul Weller, and I was never going to be a singer or played a little bit of guitar at home like everyone does and what have you. But I kind of gradually realised that I could do that ranting poetry business. I could do that. And the first ever gig I did was when me and my mate Darren from school, who I've just got back in contact with after all these years via social media, and he's now a club promoter in Thailand.
Oh wow!
Darren and I persuaded a pub called, I think it was called the Peacock in Peterborough opposite the football ground to let us come and do some poetry. And we went and did some poetry, and we did our kind of ranting, lefty, obnoxious poetry to like about a dozen of our mates, and there was about half a dozen regulars there as well, and the regulars didn't know what had hit them, and they didn't say anything until Darren did one slagging off the royal family, and they said, you've gone too far now, we didn't mind up till now, but no, don't be so rude about the Queen Mother.
So there was a kind of big anti-establishment angle to what you guys were doing.
It's all about having something to say. It's about venting your spleen. It's about,
So what were the things in 1982, 83 that you and your friends were responding to when you were putting this stuff together?
I don't think I actually started ranting until about 84, but I'm not sure. So what did I write poems about? Sexist washing powder adverts. Michael Heseltine strutting around at nuclear arms bases. So I got involved in Youth CND at this time as well. So I wrote a poem about that. I discovered one today that I'd forgotten I'd even written called Holiday in Sellafield, which was about nuclear power and government cover-ups of how dangerous it was and stuff. And what else? It Must Be the Truth. I read it in The Sun. I think Tim's put that in the new issue of Rising, hasn't he?
So I've got that one on me.
And one of the things I want to mention about that poem is one thing of huge significance for me in the time I did poetry, but also that tells you, I think, something about ranting poetry, is at one point I ended up performing that poem from the stage of a rally of Wapping strikers. So when The Sun, the people who printed and wrote The Sun, were on strike, I got up and did a poem about what a load of right-wing trash The Sun was to the people who used to produce it. And it went down brilliantly well. And it just shows, I think, it shows how those people's opinions had, I guess, changed because of the struggle they were involved in. and it showed how a young... It showed that for I can't speak for all ranters, I suppose, but for a lot of us, it was about activism as much as, or more than it was about poetry.
It's interesting that through ranting poetry and looking at the work and talking to the poets, you can kind of recover this, I guess, like a hidden radical history of stuff that was going on at the time. Because when you look back on it and you think of, you know, writers like, I mean, Bill Bryson wrote about that Wapping strike in very, very negative terms. And you've got some of the, shall I say, some of the more well-heeled members of the poetry community talking about the 80s as, oh, it was terrible, you had to cross a picket line just to get to work. And
well, you don't have to, you can stop and turn back.
I think that was one of the points that Tim Wells made when he had that comment, and that when you're engaging with this work, both stuff that was printed and stuff that was meant for performance, that you are recovering that history. So did you at the time see your role as an activist and see your role as a poet as being quite similar, or was one informing the other more?
I suppose the activist thing was more because we had quite a anti-poetry consciousness.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Things are quite different now. I'm assuming you're going to ask me about contrast between then and now a bit later, so...
I'll give you some time on that one.
Yeah, okay, so I won't do that so much at the moment, but we were like... I mean, one of the phrases Attila used to use was calling it ranting, non-boring poetry. And it was, you know, it was kind of poetry for people who didn't like poetry. It was poetry for people who thought the poetry they did at school was boring and irrelevant and all about daffodils and stiff upper lips and what have you. And we saw ourselves as a completely different thing. We didn't... Things are very different now. But then, you didn't... I can't remember ever doing... I might have done some, but I can't remember doing any poetry gigs. We did gigs with bands and stuff, you know. We did punk rock gigs. We got up in... You might have a gig with 2 or 3 bands on. When one band finished and was moving its equipment off and the other one was moving on again, they'd have a poet up.
What was
in
the
between
audience
to
response
do stuff.
to that like?
Well, it was great because often you'd be travelling to win over the audience because they probably weren't there to see poets, they were there to see bands, and they'd had a bit to drink or whatever. And generally when you started, maybe only a minority of them were even listening, and your challenge would be that by the time you'd finished, the majority of them would be listening.
So how would you achieve that?
Just by being the thing that poets at the time weren't, which was shouty and attention-grabbing and relevant and contemporary and funny and witty and, you know, sort of thing that people would want to listen to.
It seems to me that humour and kind of playfulness is kind of, by calling it ranting as well, you're setting up this quite like...
Yeah.
Fun, combative, kind of like happy warrior.
Yeah. And I think this even led in maybe to why I stopped doing it, because I stopped doing it right at the end of the 80s, I think. And so by that time I'd gone to university and I got more involved in actual political activism. You know, I didn't live in a cultural and political desert anymore. I lived in Manchester by this point. Got more involved in politics, and so I was getting up in union meetings doing speeches, and so when I'd previously been articulating myself in ranting poetry, now I was articulating myself in ranting speeches. But to me I was kind of doing the same thing, it just wasn't rhyming anymore, and it was through microphones rather than megaphones.
But you could hold an audience
or megaphones
better than...
rather than microphones. So I was still speaking at rallies and demonstrations and what have you. So
what was the difference between the time where you first discovered ranting poetry and started performing and, you know, the end of the 80s when you stopped? Because one of the things that Matthew Worley, who's another participant in this project, was saying was that, well, at the beginning of the 80s, it felt like there was a world to win. And then after the miners' strike, it felt like a really significant defeat. I mean, was that the case for you? Or?
Defeat of the miners was a huge significance, not just for ranting poets. It was hugely significant in a bad way for the working class and the working class movement of Britain, and possibly beyond as well. I think we are still living in the shadow of the defeat of that strike. I think the workers' movement has been on the defensive ever since. It's been, virtually all of our struggles have been against attacks. There have been very few victories. I mean, what victories have we had since then? We beat poll tax. There's been some progress on equalities issues, but the trade union movement and the workers' movement has been hammered since then, and that does have a psychological effect of demoralising people. And yeah, we were, and we were part of movements, so we didn't just do punk rock gigs, but most of us did benefit gigs, we did political gigs. I'd often do like a little turn at a political rally. You've got a demonstration, you have some speakers at the end, why not chuck a poet in to do a couple of things, you know?
And did it feel, I mean, how did it feel when you were at those political rallies and at those political benefit gigs? Did it feel like you're contributing to a kind of energetic political consciousness? Did it feel like you were expressing something that wouldn't otherwise be expressed in those spaces?
I guess sort of. And I was trying to remember when Tim got me to write the thing for the blog about why I stopped doing it. I was chatting with a very long-standing friend of mine about it. And I said I just couldn't remember making a decision to stop doing it. But I thought it was what I've already explained to you, that I just felt I was expressing myself in just more directly political. I could actually change more through direct participation in politics rather than just ranting about it. But she remembered me saying to her all those years ago, something I'd forgotten, that I'd said to her as I was getting more involved in politics, that I didn't think people were taking me seriously as a political woman while I carried on going on stages doing silly poems. Now, maybe that says something about me, I don't know. I think it says something quite sad. I think it says something a bit sad about the left, if it can't take people seriously, if they also have a sense of humour or do something entertaining. But I think it also speaks to the struggles of political women to be taken seriously anyway.
Did you feel that there was a similar struggle in the ranting scene to be taken seriously as a woman?
No, because it was kind of the opposite in a way. The ranting movement was very male-dominated, but it was not. But the men in it were all pretty much quite right on and quite feminist and quite embarrassed by the fact that it was so male-dominated. So it's great for me, I've got loads of gigs. You've got to have a woman on the bill, haven't you? You know, and there weren't many of us. But, you know, you get some movements that are very male-dominated, like, for example, I work on the railways and I'm active in the trade unions, and the trade unions and the railways are very male-dominated. And part of that's because the industry is male-dominated. But I have to admit, part of it is the attitudes of some of the men and the way that some of the men behave. But that wasn't the case in the Ranters movement. You know, possibly it all being based around beer-swilling blokey pubs might have had something to do with it. But, you know, I was a beer-swilling blokey young woman at the time, so that didn't particularly exclude me, I don't think.
As a fellow beer-swilling young lady, I can't see anything that wrong.
That's one of the things that's changed.
Proposition.
So many women doing performing poetry now, it's great.
Yeah.
Right?
So
and yet I still get gigs. So.
One of the things that I was thinking about before I came here today was that there must have been something pretty cool and subversive about there being this space in which, as a working class woman, you can carve out a platform by being bolshy and being funny and being acerbic, whereas in the 80s the image of a successful woman is, you think of the power dressing and the helmet hair and that kind of, you've got to forget that you come from a community or from a society and just be out for yourself. I mean, did you feel like you were reacting against that?
In a way, yeah. And I'd always been what, at the time, here's a phrase that you never hear anymore, was called a tomboy. So never wore dresses or makeup or... I'm coming back in a dress later to perform, by the way. I've only got one. It's the only one I've ever owned in my whole life.
That's like a whole meta layer of
climb
subversiveness.
Trees and play football and never did girly things and stand around gossiping about boyfriends and stuff. I just never wanted to be like that. I always wanted to mouth off. And it's like what I was saying right at the beginning about feeling at odds with the world. Now, what I know now that I didn't know then, which I think has some link to this, is that I'm autistic. I was undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome. I was diagnosed 3 years ago, and everything made sense. So that really shed light on the, not feeling like you fit in thing, and not going along with peer pressure, or not absorbing all those social protocols that you're supposed to just absorb from the world around you. They all just went over my head.
But it's interesting that it's that not fitting in which allows you to participate in this really lively, vibrant community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you feel like today there's any parallel for that kind of community or space in which people who don't fit in can find something which really speaks to them and they can speak out in?
You know what we were saying before about the miners' strike, the defeat of the miners' strike? Okay. The good thing about class struggle, and the thing to be eternally optimistic about working class struggle and the prospects for achieving socialism one day, is that actually it never, ever, ever goes away. Working class struggle is stronger at some times and weaker at other times. It has been weaker since the defeat of the miners' strike, which massively damaged it. But the really bad thing from a capitalist point of view is the working class fight the capitalist class, but the capitalist class needs the working class to continue to exist, to carry on going to work and making their profits for them. And so there will always be a struggle. They can never beat us outright. They can never destroy us. So there will always be a struggle. It will ebb and flow, and it creates cultures around it. And sometimes those are musical cultures, they're arts cultures, they're spoken word cultures. New generations create new cultures. So, for instance, there's been, over the last few years, a new wave of feminism led by younger women, which is brilliant. We're doing feminist zines and spoken word and all sorts of kind of creative stuff, and it's brought some older feminists back out of retirement, as it were, as well,
I mean, there's a lot of parallels in terms of living under a Tory government. Union busting has kind of ramped up again, which you obviously know all about, racialised police violence. And do you see there being a response in poetry to those things, or is that something you feel is lacking?
What, now?
Yeah. Now.
Because I was going to say about the 80s is that I've been reading through some of the old stuff in my fanzines, and it's actually quite sad how many of them you could just perform now and people would think you'd written them like last week. About how horrible the Tories are, or how about the police have just killed some black guy,
So one of the poems which I read, and I thought you could have written it last month, is this one, The Truth? Which is, so thank God we live in Britain. We've got freedom of choice between Matthews, Murdoch's and Maxwell's voice. All rich capitalists to a man with a vested interest in the Tory plan. Well, that's your freedom, so take it or leave it. It's written in the sun, so you'd better believe it. And just remember, when all's said and done, it must be the truth. I read it in the sun.
Well, at least Robert Maxwell's not around anymore, but I think that's probably the only thing that's changed since then, isn't it?
I mean, it could have been written a month ago.
I know. That's sad, isn't it? Although I have to say, the other one on that page, The Housewife's Trial, which is my perennial favourite, I think washing powder adverts are probably a bit less sexist now than they were in the 80s. Maybe my poem should take credit for that. Maybe I shamed them.
But now there's always like a dad doing the laundry
Yes.
kind of badly,
Yes.
and then the mum
So-
comes in with a box of dads going, "Oh, have a bit of that,"
Yeah,
and that's progress.
indeed.
That's
You are
progress. I mean, do you?
But now, sorry, you had asked about political poetry now. I'm not an expert on the current poetry scene. I started performing again last summer. There are many positive comparisons with the 80s. One is that there's like kind of sweary, shouty political poetry and poetry are not two entirely different planets anymore like they were in the 80s. I'm sure there were poetry readings in the 80s, but they'd be the last places we'd go to do our poetry. We'd just think there'd be boring gits reading boring poems in as boring a tone of voice as possible in a really boring library. And never the twain would meet between that and people ranting at punk gigs. But now you have a spoken word scene where people get up, do sweary, ranty poetry, other people do some sonnet that I'm not quite sure what it's about, or what have you. So, I think that's good. I think that's progress. I think also, obviously, rap has had a big influence, and where rappers come up from the streets, from a generation of people who that's the way they related to each other, and it become a format in itself. So that I think is better now. There's just much more of it, which is great. Just you could do an open mic every night in London if you wanted to. You could probably do 2 or 3 if you could get around quick enough. So that's excellent. The diversity of the performers is excellent. You go to gigs now, and say there's a dozen open mic slots. It won't be all white men. It'll be men, women, black, white, Asian, disabled, not disabled, old, young, and without anyone having to hold up a banner and say, don't we have a marvellously diverse set of performers? It just happens. And I think that part of that is about the democracy and accessibility of poetry, that anybody can get up and do it. One of the things that Attila used to say about ranting is that the punk rock Sex Pistols kind of philosophy that anyone can get up and play music is extended even further by ranting poetry, because actually not quite anyone can get up and play music. You do have to be able to string a few chords together a bit. Poetry, you don't even have to do that. You don't need an instrument or anything. You just get up there and do it, and that makes it a very accessible medium that people from all kinds of backgrounds can do. Is there political stuff now? Sort of, yes, in some ways. I've noticed, for instance, a lot of people do poetry about violence against women, which is really good. Somebody should do an anthology. There's a lot of really good material around about that, mainly from women, occasionally from men. But it is less explicitly political, and that's because... there is quite a lot of good LGBT poetry around as well, and there are specific LGBT poetry nights. So that kind of side of the politics of it is doing quite well, I think. But the less explicitly political stuff overall, I think, is because there aren't those movements to latch onto in quite the same way now. It's like in the 80s, we were all doing benefit gigs for the miners and the printers and CND and what have you. There was a lot of stuff to rant about and to rant in support of.
So
Yes.
I guess my very, very last question is, if you had to sum up the legacy of ranting poetry, or what you feel has been the influence of your own work, how would you sum it up?
I think it's about giving people a voice. I think it's an accessible, democratic forum through which working class people can get up and say all the things that we want to say, where you don't need an academic training, you don't need to have gone to drama school, you don't need to have privilege, you don't need to have expensive equipment. You can just get up and do it.
Cool, thank you very much.